Hi, my name is Jonathan, and welcome once again to the Jazz Musician's Voice. Jazz bassist Rufus Reid truly is the evolving bassist. Rufus Reid truly is one of the heavyweight veterans of jazz bass, one of the most recorded bassists besides Ron Carter and Milt Hinton. He's worked with really some of the top names in jazz history, including Dexter Gordon, Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz, Kenny Barron, Mulgrew Miller, Benny Golson, James Moody. I mean, you just name it, Rufus Reid has played. Rufus Reid also was a member of the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra at the Village Vanguard, and really established himself as a mainstay on the New York scene. Rufus Reid has also become an incredible educator and was the head of the jazz program at William Patterson University for well over 20 years. Bassist Rufus Reid has a very warm sound, and he's classically trained. He's really mastered the bass, and he's mastered having a identifiable tone. He has some great books that he's come out with, including one of the real standards of jazz bass, The Evolving Bassist, which came out in 1974. And he's got plenty of DVDs, including one, the Evolving Bassist DVD. So definitely recommend you check those out. Rufus Reid has played on well over 20 Jamie Ebersol play-along recordings. He's worked on television and movies. You know, you're going to hear Rufus Reid. I mean, if you're a jazz aficionado, you probably have heard Rufus Reid. He's just played with so many greats. So we sat down in Rufus's home studio in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is a very convenient location in New York and close to where some of the great recording studios were in, Van Gelder's studios and quite a few different studios in that area. And we just had a great time talking in his studio. Now, at 75 years old, Rufus Reid has become an incredible composer in its own right. And, he's one of the first jazz musicians, or the first jazz musician to win the Guggenheim Fellowship. He's won plenty of grants, and he's writing some really fantastic music. Rufus Reid was a great teacher and mentor to me, and we just had a great time having a chat as bassists, and I highly recommend you check out any of his recordings. Look him up on his website, rufusreid.com. And thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for future videos and interviews. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, today I'm here and I have the wonderful opportunity to interview a real legend of jazz bass, Rufus Reid. And now, Rufus, I know this interview was probably 8 or 9 years in the making, and we talked about it a while ago. So I'm really glad we got a chance to do it.
Well, it's good. We're here now.
Yeah. So, Rufus, I want to start a little bit about your background. So in terms of your history and, in that time in history, you were born in 1944 in Georgia, right?
In Atlanta, Georgia, yes.
Well, that must have been an interesting time to be growing up. I mean, that's right when the war was still going on. So
yes, but I mean, I had no idea anything.
Yeah,
about
not
that.
for you.
I was too young, but yeah, and I was. I remember. I guess I was about 5 or 6, and then the family, my mother and father had separated and divorced, and so we had moved to Sacramento, California. So that's basically where I was raised. We moved out there. I was about 6 years old.
So, that must have been interesting to have that shift. And it's kind of interesting because some of the guys that you later ended up playing with were just getting their feet in the door right around the time you were born. That's the start of bebop right at that time. So, coming to California, how did you get interested? I know you started playing trumpet, right?
Yes, I was playing, well, actually even before trumpet, because they ran out of trumpets when they were giving instruments out. So I played mellophone and French horn and baritone horn, but eventually I was able to get the trumpet. And the schooling in Sacramento, California at that time, which was the mid-50s, was pretty fantastic. I mean, we didn't have enough money for me to have a private teacher, but they had teachers that would come to the school a couple times a week.
Wow.
And which was great. And for me, all the basic stuff, reading, being able to follow a conductor and playing in a pit band, and of course marching, and for the football games and basketball games and all those kinds of things. So I had all that experience, which was just something to do, which I just loved. But in retrospect now, I was pretty fortunate because a lot of that is not really going on across the country like it used to be. But our teachers were really good, so I was really fortunate there.
Well, that's pretty excellent. At that time, what kind of music were you interested in? Were you just playing band music or classical or jazz? Or?
Well, it's kind of funny. I didn't really know. I never thought about classification and stuff. When I was in high school, I did see Louis Armstrong live.
Wow.
And that was pretty mind blowing. And I saw when we were in high school. I remember going to see the Stan Kenton Big Band, and the trumpet players were playing higher than I didn't even know was even possible on the trumpet. But our band director exposed us to a lot of different kinds of music, and so I played. I guess I played in woodwind ensembles and played some classical music. I did have a small group where we began to play pop tunes, and back then I've been thinking about the kind of tunes that were popular on the radio, and it was still hard to figure that out. But I used to be in the band with an accordion player and a tenor saxophone player, and I played trumpet and bass and drums. And every time we took a break, I would kind of go over to the bass and just kind of touch it, and that was my first infatuation of the instrument. But we played, there could be movies that were popular at that time. One was called Love is a Many Splendored Thing. It's a very old movie, but the song was super popular. And so we would go to the music store and kind of sit down and look at the sheet music and write it down, because there was no no real book or any of that kind of stuff. So then we would add things, and we would play whatever was popular on the radio at that time, I think,
Well, but that's pretty cool, and it's kind of interesting because you look at today, and young players have so many different resources that weren't available at that time, yet some of the players that were at that time you were coming up are still a different level, and I think it must be that having to really be thirsty for the music,
Well, yes, and sometimes when you have too much information, you don't feel that you need to work for it. It's there, but it also disappears quickly as it comes. So I guess I really did have to listen, but we played in bands, we played in school plays, we did all kinds of things, and went to festivals with the big band. I wasn't a very good trumpet player, and some of my friends were very happy to tell me that I wasn't a very good trumpet player. But we went down to, I'll never forget this, because we went down to Long Beach. It was a festival for they call them stage band festivals at that time. You know, so I guess we did play some Neil Hefti stuff that came from Count Basie's band. And so, but I never really thought about this is real jazz as opposed to what it was just music that he gave us to play. But we heard this big band rehearsing in L.A. at the Union Hall. That was one of our things that he made it possible for us to go to one of these rehearsals. And the whole saxophone section sounded louder than our entire band with drums. You know, it was amazing. I didn't know saxophones could even play that loud, you know, with that full body. But that was a revelation to me in terms of, wow, the interest was perked really and peaked really heavy. So my high school days are really, really very, very memorable.
Well, you know, that's great. You know, that's what it takes to get you to have the jazz bug, so to speak. But then you did join the military. How did that come about? Was that more like the draft, or was it more of a personal decision?
Well, it was both. It was the draft for sure. I was definitely going to get drafted, and I was 17 years old, so my mother had to sign for me to go, and I had never really defied her. I left the house to go to the college to sign up for the next semester, you know, get my classes and all that stuff. And I was 3 people from the desk, and I bolted, and I just left and went, because I had heard that the Air Force, if you audition for the Air Force band, not the Army, the Air Force band, and you passed the audition, you were automatically put in the band after boot camp. That sure sounded pretty good to me.
Yeah.
So I went, and I passed by the skin of my teeth, but I did pass. And so I went home, and as soon as I got through the door, my mother says, "What classes did you take?" And so then I had to drop it on her. I said, well, I didn't go. And I went to the recruiter, and I signed up for the Air Force, and boy, she hit the ceiling. However, I said, you'd rather me carry a rifle? You know, and then all of a sudden she started to calm down a little bit. But think about that. I was going to get drafted. There was no, there was no foregone conclusion of that. So, and she knew how passionate I was about the music, and I said, well, the difference was the Air Force was 4 years, as opposed to Army being 2 years active and 2 years inactive. But nevertheless, I was in the band, and that's where I began to teach myself the bass. And that's where everything happened for me at that point, in terms of whatever's happening to me now would not have happened had I not done that. I'm all very confident about that. I may have picked up the bass at one time, or I don't really know. No one really knows.
Yeah.
However, for me, I have fond memories of the military, and because it changed my entire life. You know.
Yeah. Well, so you got interested in the bass. You're in the military. What was the 4 years of military like, as far as your playing situations? I mean, what inspired you from that point to begin classical bass and move to Seattle?
Well, to compress it a little bit, I was in Montgomery, Alabama. That was my first assignment, and I was there in 1961. I was there during the Bay of Pigs. I was there also when Kennedy got assassinated, And I was also there when they had just opened up where I could actually sit on a bus somewhere. So Montgomery was very, very decided, separated. You know, the black people lived on one side of the town, and the other white people on the other side of the town. But you had to go through the town, and of course the merchants. They wanted to sell suits and shirts and everything, so they would take your money. But Montgomery was wonderful, because that's when I heard Ike Tina Turner for the first time. That's when I saw Bobby Blue Bland's band. That's where in Birmingham, Alabama, this is the first time I saw James Brown's band. And he was working two drummers out then, and then I actually saw the first Motown review from Detroit with the Supremes and the Marvelettes and the Contours, and then I heard the band play jazz, you know, before the rock and roll singers would come out, and I said, wow. But I got to see Ike and Tina Turner's, because they had 3-horn front line. It was amazing. I mean, it was powerful. I mean, really powerful. And that just kind of, and I had to learn stuff off of the jukebox on a Wednesday, because Friday was the gig. So, you know, the whole band had to sit in front of a jukebox and play the record over and over, and I had to learn the bass parts on electric bass, because I didn't have wasn't strong enough or good enough to play the double bass, and but the guy let me play on a Wednesday, because we had a Wednesday night jazz thing, and I played a few tunes, and boy, that was pretty special. And his name was Al Stringer, the leader, and he was a saxophone player who went in the Army with Cannonball and Nat Adderley, and he could play organ as well, and he taught me. He's the one that taught me tunes, and he says, okay, don't mess it up anymore. You know, like, whoa, you know. And then my awareness of who Horace Silver was, I went with this girl to this club in Birmingham, Alabama, and I heard I said, wow, listen to that bass line, what is that? So I went to the jukebox and I looked and said, Horace Silver, who's that? I don't know, but people were dancing like crazy. And I said, wow. And that was the first time I'd heard that. My brother, prior to my going into the Air Force, gave me a record of Miles Davis. I was 15, I think. The one that's called Walking. It's got the stoplight on the cover. Mm-hmm. And Lucky Thompson is the only other, and Kenny Clark are the only two people out of the quintet that I never got a chance to meet. You know, Horace Silver, then Percy Heath was there. You know, I met Miles. I didn't really get to know Miles at all. But Percy and Heath and I became close. There's a picture of him right there on the wall there. And Horace was playing piano, you know. I mean, it's amazing. So when I look back, I had stuff, but I didn't, and I played those records, I just loved it. I had no idea that this was, I mean, I never thought about this being jazz. I knew it wasn't marching music, and I knew it wasn't classical music, but it was what it was, and I loved it, you know. But the military, the thing in Montgomery, and then a year and a half later, I moved, they shipped me to Japan, and I had to stay an extra year. And that's when I began to study the classical music from a retired Tokyo principal bassist of the Tokyo Symphony. And then the CO, because there were a lot of trumpet players and more than we needed, so I said, could I play bass in the concert band so I can just read the bass. Because I had to learn how to play bass clef too.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And, so all that was good for me, you know.
So, you start classical bass in Japan, and then what was it that made you decide, okay, I want to go study in Seattle, classical bass?
Well, when I was in Japan, that's when I saw Ray Brown live. I said, that's what I want to do. I saw the Modern Jazz Quartet. I saw Duke Ellington's band. I saw Blue Mitchell and Junior Cook and Toshiko Akiyoshi was playing piano. I saw Charlie Persip and Philly Joe Jones and those guys in Japan. I saw more jazz in Japan. I mean, up close, that I would have had I lived here in the States. And so when I came back, when I finally got out of the military, I sold my trumpet and bought a bass the same week. And my priority was to get a teacher, a real teacher, to teach me how to play the bass, not to play jazz, but to play the bass better. So I said it was time for me to go back to college, since I hadn't gone.
Yeah.
So I said, well, let me see if I audition. And when I moved to Seattle, actually, technically I moved to Mercer Island because my brother lived there, and he basically says, hey, why don't you come live with us for a little while and get your act together, So for a couple of years I didn't have to pay any rent. I didn't have to pay any food. He let me have his car, and all he did was practice all day and go to jam sessions, and then beginning to take lessons and stuff. And so I sought, my first real teacher was James Harnett, who was the principal of the Seattle Symphony at that time, who in the beginning says, I don't teach jazz people. That's exactly what I said, But I made a nuisance out of myself, and I called him again. And then eventually he let me come, and he listened to me, and he says, do you have a bow? And so I pulled out this bow, and he says, I don't teach German bow. And I said, oh, I didn't know there were two. At that time, it was amazing. So I said, okay, I'll get one. What does it look like? And so he showed me. And then I came back, and he gave me about 10, 12 pages of stuff to practice. And I knew he wasn't going to see me anymore,
Yeah.
But I worked and hacked on it, and I came back, and I think he began to see that I was serious, that I really wanted him to help me. And he did. He got me up to snuff so that I could send in a tape to Northwestern, UCLA, Oberlin, Indiana University, because every one of them had great bass teachers. And that was my only reason for going. But I ended up in Chicago because that was the only place where I could actually work and make some money going to school. The other schools were really great, but they were in cornfields or something like that, and I didn't want to stay in LA. So the rest is history there. But so Chicago, I went 1969, and I began to study with Warren Benfield, who was the principal, not the principal, he was in the section of Chicago Symphony, but he taught at Northwestern, and Joseph Guastafeste, who was the principal of Chicago at that time. And both of them really just embraced me and really taught me what I needed to know.
And so, going back to both Seattle and Chicago, as far as taking bass lessons. I wanted to ask you about your experience with like classical orchestras, because I remember talking with Ron Carter. He was discouraged from playing classical music because they said they'd never accept someone of color in their orchestra. Did you experience some of that?
No, at that time I wasn't even trying to be in an orchestra or any of that. I'm not sure if Ron was too. I know Richard Davis had issues, and Art Davis also had issues. It was just the wrong time, because Richard Davis, he could play the bass incredibly. He was trained to do that. But unfortunately, racially, that wasn't happening. But in retrospect, I think it was a blessing in disguise, as far as I'm concerned, because Richard would have been lost in that world. My first experience of playing with an orchestra was in Chicago at Northwestern. I mean, to really sit because you have to understand, I was playing jazz like at least 6 or 7 years before I even got there, and those last 2 or 3 years in Japan, or the last year and a half in Japan, man, I was really playing a lot. So I was hearing stuff. So when I sat in the orchestra, I'm playing a low note, but I'm hearing this incredible chord that's being played. And that's when I got it. I mean, that's when it hit me. Because everybody said, well, you know, jazz is this, and classical, and they don't like this, and they don't like this, and this is best, and this is best. But when I began to really hear that orchestra, I finally got, this is what people are talking about. This is pretty deep. I like this. And yet I wasn't improvising, but I had to really play well to hang. Yeah. So that was a big deal for me. And then, of course, I had to pass my exams to get my degree from Northwestern as a performance major. So I really had to buckle down, I mean, seriously, to pass and to get my degree. And then Chicago, after I did that, Chicago was a birthplace for me to really play jazz every week with different people. You know, it was amazing.
Yeah, now we'll get into the real juice of jazz stories, because you know, honestly, you came at a time about, you're about 7 or 8 years younger than like Ron Carter and
about 8 years.
That generation.
Right.
So you came at a time when there were some incredible guys still playing, and you must have worked with some great names, you know, in Chicago. You know, I know you already began working with some pretty incredible musicians. You know, we're talking Dexter Gordon and Dizzy, Stan Getz, Art Farmer. So tell us a little bit about the evolution of your jazz playing to a point where you started really working with the main names.
Well, Chicago was the pinnacle. That was the place, because people from New York were coming to play, people from LA would come, and I was fortunate enough to become one of the house bass players for Joe Siegel's Jazz Showcase. And every week there was somebody that I didn't even know, you know, like to me that was my school. That was that. And I got a chance to play with, it's a who's who almost. It was amazing to me that I did get a chance. Kenny Dorham, you know, there's a Clark Terry and Kenny Burrell. You know, I played a little bit with McCoy. Not he came one time by himself, but long time ago. Um, um, Harold and Bobby Hutcherson. Um, um, oh man, amazing! And
Yeah.
Harold and Bobby were the ones that took me to Europe for the very first time. But Chicago at that time was like pretty amazing. It was, and the musicians in Chicago were really high level, and there was a lot of recording. There was a lot of jingle industry at that time was pretty heavy, and I tried to keep my foot in it a little bit, but my first boss was Eddie Harris, and then eventually I did some things with Nancy Wilson, and that's when I began to really understand the business and what's really out there, because I was playing the jazz clubs, you know, late at night. You know, back then we played at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But then I would play these concerts with Nancy Wilson in concert halls, and she's in gowns with the orchestras and stuff, and a totally different kind of event, you know. And I was getting all that, you know.
Well, you know, for people who want to know more about the Chicago scene, because it's probably very different now. What would be some of the other spots you mentioned? The showcase. What would be some other spots that you played in Chicago?
In Chicago, down on the south side, there was one place was called the Apartment, but I played Von Freeman. Von Freeman.
Von Freeman.
Oh man, he was amazing, and I played with him a lot. His brother was a guitar player, George Freeman. But so I would play there quite often on the south side, and actually there was a place where I did some regular stuff. What was the name of that place? Wow, we're talking about a long time ago.
Yeah, this is the 70s, so we're talking 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. And but I tell you, it was like we played this like Friday, Saturday, and Sunday shows, and it was close to my house. It was great. I did that for a couple years, you know, getting locally. I played a little bit at the London House, which was downtown, where it basically closed, but that was the really tuxedo kind of, you know, you had to have a coat on and looking really nice. But that's where George Shearing used to play, and Oscar Peterson Trio, and I mean, that ilk of players that would come in that place, and then Herbie Hancock eventually came in there with his Imwadishi band, and the club was basically on its way out, because everything was changing there, you know.
Yeah.
Everything was changing, and it was totally amazing, you know. But the south side and the north side, I mean, they were really different poles, and because of my training, I was able to function in both.
In both of them.
You know.
Well, you know, that time period, like you said, was big transition, coming into more of the electric sound and the fusion era. Where did you feel like you were kind of staying true to the more acoustic era, or the electric, or
well, I played electric bass. That's how I started out on electric bass. I didn't even own the double bass, but eventually, and I played bass like James Jamerson or Chuck Rainey, or those, you know, I played bass. And then later on, after coming here, I had I played with Jack DeJohnette you know, and that's when all the finger popping and all this kind of stuff. And I took a couple of lessons trying to figure out the thumping, and I just really couldn't. My heart really wasn't in it, but I didn't have to do it because I was in Chicago at the time. I was playing. I didn't have to play electric bass. Everybody just loved it. In fact, a lot of the bass players got pissed at me because my first gig with a Chicago person, they heard me at a jam session, but this guy never heard me. He just called me up. I heard you really play good, man, and you're new in town. I got a gig. You want it? I said, sure. What kind of music? Because I was taking both instruments, both electric and the upright, to the gigs, because that's what the music was. He said, oh, we just playing some standards, some straight ahead stuff, some bebop stuff. I said, okay. So I left the electric bass at home. But at that time, most of the guys weren't using pickups either. And it was I had the early Barkus Berry pickup on or something. It was awful, but I got a pretty decent sound out of it. And the moment he saw me, he looked around and, where's your electric bass? I said, well, I didn't bring it. Oh, man, what are you doing? Didn't I tell you? I said, but I asked you what kind of music. And so he was not happy. But we're right there. We had to, so he started counting off. And I forget what tune it was, but I knew it, and I started playing. And then he started playing. Then he turned around and he said, wow, that sounds good, you know. But he could hear it, you know, because the electric bass, you could turn that sucker up, you know. And,
yeah.
And that's what was really happening at that time. And a lot of the upright players said, oh, well, just leave the bass at home. And most of the gigs, so the guy said, yeah, man, I forgot what that sounds like. Yeah, that's great. You know, and he was an older guy, so he really knew what it sounded like. And eventually, I got calls from some of the bass players, said, man, what you doing here? I said, I have to dust off my upright, man. I have to, they want me to bring this to the gig, you know. I said, hey, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But that I've never had to play the electric bass. And today, as you know, it's a totally different animal, and has been for quite a while.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so you're already working quite a bit in Chicago. What really prompted your move to
Here,
New York? We're here in Teaneck, New Jersey.
well, the real impetus, I always wanted to come, but there were at least a couple years, the last couple years in Chicago, where the work really diminished considerably. And I was working locally, and I was making enough money, and I was okay, but it got pretty lean. And fortunately, my wife was working too, and you know, we were okay. But it was different. So, and I hadn't played with Bobby Hutcherson probably in a couple years after he had taken us to Europe, you know, which was like, wow, it was amazing. So he comes back, and Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I knew I wasn't ready. I had lost my edge, whatever, because you do lose it if you don't work
practice,
it.
yeah.
If you don't work at it. So Friday, I did okay, but I came home and I said, oh man, that sucked. I got to go back tomorrow, and I mentally got it back. Saturday was a little better, but it still was not like I remember. And then we had a Sunday matinee, and it got a little bit better. And then Sunday night, and it was a little bit better, but then the gig was over. So Bobby Hutcherson, bless his heart, he comes to me and he's going to pay me. And as soon as he gives me my money, he says, looks me dead in the eye, he says, What's wrong? Your shit is down. Oh man, talking about somebody, it was like he just slapped him and hit with a baseball bat. And I knew it wasn't happening, but I didn't want him to tell me it wasn't happening. And I love him to this day because he knew I had dropped the ball a little bit, you know. And so I went home and I told my wife, I was almost in tears, and I said, you know, we're out of here. We're out of here, you know. So, but it still took a couple of years to mentally get together and, you know, really try to save as much money as possible, you know, to make this move. And eventually we did. But I'll never forget that because he really did care enough. And eventually, the next time I saw him, which was almost 3 years later, was on the recording with Dexter Gordon, Manhattan Symphony, and he was on it. And we hadn't spoken since that event. Wow. That evening. And he was over in the corner fixing, because one of the strings had broken on the vibes and we had taken a break, and Slide Hampton had written some really nice bass lines and had a couple solos for me and some arco stuff. So everybody went to lunch and I stayed there to try to work on the stuff. And so it was Bobby and I. And eventually he looked up and I said, "Hey Bobby, how you doing?" He says, "Yeah, stuff's not down now," you know. And it was really great. But he remembered. He remembered big time, and I will never forget it. But we all kind of need a kick in the butt sometimes, just to, because if you're going to be in whatever you want to call it, because a lot of people say, Are you gonna make it? What did you make it? I don't know what that means, you know. But I was hoping to be in New York. Maybe I'll give it 10 years or something like that. And I've been here 40 years already, and I'm still doing stuff that I hadn't done before. So, but that I'm always reminded that you have to play. And you have to keep your stuff up, you know. And so that's what I can try to do, you know.
Well, absolutely, man. And, you know, since you moved to New York, you know, you were really one of the top call players, and you're working with Thad Jones, Mel Lewis Orchestra.
That was the band that people saw me first. I did a recording with Lee Konitz prior to that, because Lee gave me the first gig I had here in New York. Then I did a recording with Lee, was Albert Daly and Joe Chambers and myself, and then I actually also did another record with Henry Threadgill with like 3 bass clarinets and baritone saxophones and 4 bass players, and because he was from Chicago at that time, and when he moved here, that was one of the early years.
Well, you know, working with a big band such as the Thad Jones, Mel Lewis Orchestra, eventually became the Vanguard Orchestra. That's not easy stuff. I mean, just as a bass player, working with a big band is difficult. So, you know, being one of those guys who was really associated with that group.
Well, that band was very special. Both he and Mel Lewis, Dad and Mel, were incredible. And the bass chair was a hot chair. I mean, it started out with Richard Davis, and then, you know, George Mraz I replaced him. All of us had subbed on the band for a while, you know, but I was there for the last 2.5 years that Thad was and Mel were together. And I feel very fortunate to have had that time. But that's how I basically was introduced to the city, because the band was very popular, so a lot of people would come down. Who's that bass player? Where'd he come from? You know, and you do have to read, and you had to read well. I met Thad maybe a couple years earlier at a workshop in Wichita, Kansas, and we kind of hit it off. He said, "You need to come to New York," you know. I said, "Well, I'm working on it. I'm trying to, you know." "You need to come to New York." You know? And so he told Mel about me, and eventually, so you talk about, Mel and the band came to Chicago. So I went to go see them, and George Mraz was there, and man, the band was killing, just. So I said, I said, "Well, you know, I'm going to be in New York such and such March, and looking for a place to stay." And he said, "Well, oh yeah, let me know when you're going to do that, because I can get you, maybe you can play on a Monday night." So I let him know, and he said, "Well, we got a gig on Sunday, and then if you come in and play the gig, and then you play Monday night." I said, "Okay." So my rehearsal was on the bus, looking at the music.
Yeah.
But I already knew a lot of the music, and I knew all the hard stuff that, you know, the tiptoe, which was the bass and trombone unison thing, and there's some other, and I just loved the band, so and that was the first tune he called on the gig. Say, "Is this a test or what?" You know, and the rest is history. You know.
Well, you know, that's such a great group, and I recommend people listening to this interview. Transitioning quite a little bit, you have a reputation as being the evolving bassist, but also a no-nonsense guy. I mean, you steer clear of all the stuff that so many of your contemporaries never, got past. So you steer clear of the drugs, you steer clear of the nonsense, the alcohol, the other issues. Tell us a little bit about what that was for you, and how you did that.
To be quite honest with you, it was always a mystery to me. I had no idea why everybody got all messed up behind of it. But I was fortunate, I guess, that something in maybe my upbringing or when I saw things happen. Well, it started when I came back from Japan, getting out of the military. My buddy in California says, "Yeah, man, we do these jam sessions. We play every day in San Francisco." And I said, "Oh man, great." So when I went down there and I had my bass and I was ready to play, and we finally get there. I get there late in the afternoon, and so he said, "Well, let's go get something to eat." "Or when are we gonna play?" "Well, we'll play tomorrow." And I said, "Okay." So I go get something to eat, and then after a while, then some guys come over and they start smoking some weed and stuff, and then I said, I didn't like it. I tried it once, but I said, "But when are we gonna play?" We'll get to tomorrow." I was there a week. Tomorrow never came. And I said, I think, like maybe I forget what day, maybe I was there 3.5 days or 4 days. And I said, I think I'm gonna go back to Sacramento and I'll see you guys later, because I never played. I think maybe once, and everybody was pretty blasted then. I said, well, oh man, what a disappointment. So I said, well, I'm not going to deal with that. And people were a lot surprised because when I was with Eddie Harris, all he said was, all I need you to do is be on time and be able to play. That was the operative word, able to play. Be able to pick up your instrument. And then when I went to Japan, there was no drugs in Japan, particularly at that time. They put you under the jail, you know. And then I came back and come here, and I got a chance to play with Dexter Gordon. And of course, Dexter was drinking a lot, but he was also an alcoholic. So people thought that's how he played, because he played so laid back. But I played with him when he wasn't drinking at all, and he still played the same way. And but he liked cocaine and all the, you know, and they loved me because I didn't want any of it. So it was more for them, you know. And people were wondering, how did I get that gig? Because I didn't do nothing. You know? But I didn't see the value of it to spend money on it. Money, even to this day, I don't see how people do it because of the cost and the distractions. And many of the players, like you said, that I actually got a chance to play with, got hung up in some way or another. Eventually, it caught up with them. And hey, I have no time to waste on somebody else. I just try to keep my stuff together, and I feel really adamant about it. Doesn't necessarily or will make you play better than you think, you know, and history tells you that. But hey, to each his own. You take yourself out of the game, you know. That's what most of the people did. You know?
Well, you know, now moving from that, a couple more questions. You know, obviously, you're one of the most recorded jazz bassists, and you've got hundreds of recordings.
Well, next to Ron,
you know, I don't know if you. I don't know what. I'm not sure what your count is up there, but yeah, I mean, you're on quite a few things. I know you talk about this a little bit in your book, The Evolving Bassist, but talk a little bit about developing your sound. I mean, you as Rufus Reid, you got that quintessential bass sound, you know.
Well, you know, I don't really know. People ask me about that, and I don't really know how there's a sound that I like. There's a sound that I've listened to recordings. Ron was my hero, and Paul Chambers and Oscar Pettiford had a great sound. And then I heard Ray Brown, and I actually saw him live. But and each one had their own thing. And then I saw Eddie Gomez play my bass, and he sounded just like Eddie Gomez. And Ray played my bass, and he sounded just like Ray. So I said, oh, wow. So there is something to that. There's a sound that I think eventually culminates in your head of what sounds good to you. And once I get into something, because that's why we're always searching for strings and all trying to figure something that really identifies, like this, what you want to sound like. And of course, I never think about it, and until someone like yourself says, well, you know, you have this sound, and other people say, wow, I can hear like 2 bars on the recording, and I know it's you. And I said, okay, had I not done any recording, you wouldn't have been able to do that. So, but I listened back some of my early recordings, like maybe in the 80s. The sound is there. I'd like to think it's just as good, if not matured, you know. But I think it comes to whatever you hear, it becomes consistent with. But I've been also very fortunate, say with Dexter, he had a huge, robust sound. So I had to be robust. Eddie Harris had a beautiful sound. He could play out to lunch, he could play ballads, he could play, and he just, if he could play it funky, he wanted all of those things. So you had to be able to like be flexible, be pliable. Stan Getz had a golden sound. So he didn't need a real harsh kind of angst sound in the bass, or even the pianist or a drummer. That everyone had to play beautifully. You know, it just makes sense to me. But I've been fortunate that Benny Golson's sound on the saxophone is absolutely glorious. So you play with that sound to try to embrace that sound. And I like beautiful things. I use a lot of vibrato. Because that just, and I think that's why people also call me, because I make everything feel easier. But that's our job. I mean, for me, the drums and bass are supposed to make the horn players sound better than they ever could with anybody else. You know, so I don't know how one acquires it, except but if you think about it too much, you ain't gonna get it. I think you just have to go ahead and play the music as best as possible and get a rich sound.
Right. Absolutely, you have that, you know. Okay, so I wanted to ask you a little about going into education, because you're one of the real founding people in jazz scholarship at William Patterson University, and I know you're also playing bass on some of the Jamie Aebersold tracks, which is also a lot of guys are playing to practice. So talk to us a little bit about how you came in to teach at William Patterson University.
Well, I'd have to go back back to Eddie Harris just for a moment, because that's where Jamie Aebersold heard me play in Eddie Harris's band. And so he approached me. He says, "Would you like to do a clinic with me?" And I didn't even know what the clinic was. You know, what are you talking about? He says, "Yeah, I've got an opportunity to go up in North Dakota." Okay, all right. And went up there and with Jamie and had these little kids, and it was a lot of them, and they didn't know anything, you know, because that's why we were there. And so I had to write out some things for them, and then I told them about Ray Brown's book. And so then we come back, and I'm talking to Eddie Harris. I said, "Man, Ray Brown doesn't even know I just sold 25 of his books for him." And he said, "Well, why don't you write your own book?" I said, "What do you mean?" "Write your own book." I said, "Well, no, who they write?" He said, "Who are they?" He said, "You're intelligent, right?" I said, "Yeah." "You're a college graduate?" "Yes." "You're out here playing with me?" "Yes." "And we're on Atlantic Records?" "Yes." "Write your own book." So that's how it started, around 1972. And every night I would come home after we'd playing, and, you know, still kind of a lot of energy and not going to sleep. And I didn't hang out at the bar all the time. So I would start writing stuff. Eventually I had a bunch of stuff, and then it worked it down. So the book ends up being my wife's and our first child, actually, you know. So Eddie Harris says, "Now listen, I need you to do two things. If you're gonna write this book, you have to finish it, because most people don't finish anything that they start. And then he says, I want you to own it. Whoa. I didn't know how profound that statement was, particularly at that time. And to this day, I still own it. And it's still out on the market. And it came out in 1974.
Wow, yeah, it's really one of the standards. So.
And if it was a piano book or guitar player, I'd be a millionaire probably. But it's just a bass player's book, you know.
What, 46 years now.
But that's how it got started. And one thing led to another, and a lot of people began to understand. And then that's how I started doing some more clinics with Jamie. And then he would... I'm on volume 1 of the hundreds of his things. I did about probably 20 over the years. And it was an education itself. I've always, for some reason, because I had students, but I didn't really want to be a teacher because I didn't want to be like some of the teachers I had. Mm. But if someone heard me play and they said, man, do you give lessons? I said, no. But they made a nuisance of themselves in a good way. I said, okay. Because I remember myself going to James Harnett.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And I said, okay. And then my wife had to remind me. He said, well, you know, you just went over an hour. You got 2 people waiting for you. Blah, blah. So I had to learn how to budget my time, et cetera, et cetera. But I always enjoyed the light going on. And then, how I got to William Patterson, I was here in New York playing with Dexter Gordon, and Thad Jones was artist in residence at William Patterson. And we would go out with the quartet, with Thad and Mel and Harold Danko and myself, and do each semester for a couple of years. We would do a workshop, clinic, demonstration, whatever. And Dr. Martin Criven, who was the coordinator at that time, was also there, and he was observing me because Thad would say, Rufus, talk about what you do with the bass, and Harold, what do you do with the voicings and the piano, et cetera, et cetera. And so then one August, Dr. Criven calls me. He says, have you seen Thad? No, I know he went to Europe to do some stuff with the Danish Radio Orchestra, but that was happening anyway. And I wasn't playing with him anymore. You know, I had already been with Dexter. And, well, he had the school started. Actually, he called me. It was actually almost October, and he says, "Have you seen Thad?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, school." They had hoped to see him in August, you know, to kind of set up stuff. So he said, well, "Would you mind coming out to school and just kind of check stuff out?" And I said, "Well, I didn't really come here to teach, man. No. Well, just come out one day." And I did, and wow, that was kind of fun. No big deal. I didn't think I'd be there that long anyway, you know. Yeah. So I go there, and he says, "We'd like you to do it regular." I said, "What?" I said, "I might be gone for 2 months with Dexter." I mean, because we were traveling a lot then. He says, "It's okay." I said, "What?" I never heard that before.
Yeah.
So I said, but I didn't have any classes. I didn't have to correct papers, and I didn't have a classroom. I just worked with the ensembles, and I ended up being the director of the program. And he said, "No, I have my own ideas how I want this thing to work." And lo and behold, that's how I got started. And then before I know it, I was there 20 years.
Wow, yeah, I mean, He retired like 99 or 2000.
Correct.
Yeah.
1999.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, I ended up, I think I met you at like a international bass workshop and took a lesson with you. And then a few years later, I ended up at William Patterson. So the program is pretty great. But yeah, I know that's like a kind of a pattern with that program. James Williams. Oh, I didn't intend to be here. And
James, I wanted because it started a certain precedence of professionals, people who were making a name for themselves. And once you got into the academia, they wanted to put handcuffs on you.
Yeah.
And then you're not who you are anymore. But yes, there had to be a compromise with the persons, the individuals, to make this thing work. But that was at the birth. It was at the beginning of jazz education. They had a program with some big band stuff down at North Texas State, which was pretty much all big band stuff. They had something happening at Berklee School of Music, and they had some really good players, but there was no degree program. And then here they had Kenny Barron, Larry Ridley, Freddie Waits, Ted Dunbar, had a program at Rutgers, but they were not sanctioned by, they were just there under the auspice of some extra stuff, but they didn't have a champion like I did, someone who protected them and said, listen, we need these guys in there. And so, because of my knowledge, that was the very first jazz program in the tri-state area, I mean, with heavy-duty players. But they didn't have a degree program at that time. And they certainly didn't have a Bachelor of Music, it was like a Bachelor of Arts or something like that. And then but the money wasn't actually sanctioned by Rutgers. It came through some grants and stuff, and some of that stuff just disappeared.
Yeah.
And that was ugly. So, to make a long story short, we ended up having the program. I ended up being there longer than I thought I would. Before I know it, I was there 20 years. But it's still going on. Then I said, James Williams, I need you. I needed to pass the baton to someone who's really in the trenches. And so he took it. And then he enjoyed it and was really doing really well. And then he became ill.
Yeah.
And then 2 years lapsed of trying to get somebody. And then Mulgrew finally said, okay. And the president of the university sanctioned all of it, because he was at the beginning with Thad. So he knew how strong the music program was. And so that's how it worked. The sad part was that Mulgrew, he also became ill. And then he was there a couple of years longer than James. And now the program is really doing well with Bill Charlap as the jazz artist there and the director, and I'm so happy because what was missing at the time between Mulgrew and Bill, and actually between James and Mulgrew, there was a lack of consistency. And I'd like to think that I helped establish that consistency, and even though I was in and out, I got Kenny Burrell to take my place to come in for an entire year when I took sabbatical. And so the students, oh, that's Kenny Burrell, I better go practice, just to see somebody, that's really into it. So I needed that, and that passion that both James had and Mulgrew had, and Bill Charlap has that passion. and he's also they needed some notoriety of some sort to keep, you know, why does anybody want to go to school to William Patterson as opposed to somewhere else, you know?
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking about that. Kind of a little side to that. The topic I've been discussing with a lot of my peers and people who are considering going to jazz programs now. It's become quite expensive. There's some of these programs, for example, you might spend close to $300,000. You know, I'm not going to name names.
Yeah.
The big name programs in New York, and it's just becoming more expensive. What would you think? Do you think it's justified to do that, or to work on your own now as young jazz musicians coming into a jazz world where there's not as many gigs and there's not?
Well, I hear you, and it is true. It is a different ball field now, you know, than certainly years ago. I've always said, even though I was a director of a program, that you didn't need to come to college to learn how to play this music. It just allowed you to learn and compress it and get really saturated faster. That doesn't mean it's actually going to last, though, or that you're going to be successful at it. But unfortunately, if you could play, I just heard some high school kids last week. They're from all over the country. I heard a little 16-year-old saxophone player, and this little girl played the mess out the saxophone. She could read. She was reading all Thad Jones' first alto stuff like it was nothing. And the whole band was like that. The drummer was killing, and then I saw him go to the piano, and he was killing over it. I said, what are they feeding these kids, you know? But they're out there. But those kids don't necessarily need to come to school, because they're already playing really better than a whole lot of people that go to the school. However, so if they have other interests, composition, ethnomusicology, or literature, or medicine, or that, I mean, just bring it on. But yeah, because it's kind of gotten that way, and I really feel that when we listen and study the music and hear Freddie Hubbard and hear about all these Tony Williams when they were 16, 17, man. So, but I think everyone needs a college education.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, where do you put your monies and your interests? If you're already in motion, I mean serious in motion, well then you don't need to go to a jazz school, which is a lot of people are very, very cookie cutter kind of concept. And it's gotten that way. It didn't begin that way, but it's kind of gotten that way. There's pros and cons of all of it, and you know, like I say, I was knee deep in all of it, and I believe a lot of it is excellent. But when I was teaching, I taught all kinds of ways in terms of how one gathers information and the usage of all your senses and everything, so that you didn't become so dependent on this thing or this iPad here or this real book. If you didn't know how to transcribe or play something by just listening to it, what's up, you know? So all of it's good, and a lot of it is not so good. But as far as I'm concerned, players who, like for instance, I heard these young players have a lot more to offer to our lives and to themselves if they just, but don't get rid of anything, but just add to it, you know. Yeah. And I believe this is kind of where we are coming now. It's kind of, if we don't start doing these kinds of things, I think the schools are going to start dropping, people are going to start dropping off, because they don't need to go there. You know?
Absolutely. Well, kind of moving from that, maybe just a couple minutes about. So you worked hard on the Evolving Bassist, right?
I did.
You've worked hard on a DVD for the Evolving Bassist. Talk a little bit about someone who's worked so hard on some of these things, and we have the evolution of internet piracy now. You know, the records, we're having Spotify now where musicians are not getting paid as much. What would be your advice for how young musicians should continue to try to make a living when we are facing this?
Well, it's a tough one to and I can't give you an answer except that I think you should own everything of whatever you produce, and have it. As Eddie Harris would say, if it collects dust, it's your dust. But if you stay visible and you stay healthy, and you, as your abilities mature and grow, all your stuff does. And eventually, I have to be optimistic that eventually something's good gonna come out of this.
Sure.
It's unfortunate that the piracy, everything happened so fast, nobody even saw it happening. The iPhone, the iTunes, all that stuff, you know, nobody's willing to pay for anything.
Yeah, it's like an entitlement culture.
Right, and eventually that's going to back up on the people who are at fault. But to answer your question, like I've got a couple of recordings I'm just finished. I'm going to be doing something, and I'm going to just produce it. I've always produced my own stuff anyway, but because for some reason bass players, you know, Ron probably was the first one to actually be on a major label for a good period of time. But hey, I just got the mentality of owning it, and unfortunately the digital stuff, I just recorded a vinyl and on Nouvelle Records. We have one out. It's been out. It'll be 2 years this December with my trio with Steve Ali and the Duca da Fonseca and the Sirius Quartet, which is a string quartet. And I just finished a new one. It's going to be the end of the 5th season of Nouvelle Records, and with a duo with Sullivan and Fortner playing piano, and I'm really happy about that. But that's not going to come out, and when it does come out it'll come out on vinyl, and you can't get it digitally. And I'm saying if anybody wants my new CD or anything, they have to come to my website.
That's great. You know,
that's the only way. That's the only defense
yeah.
that we have with this stuff. You know, and here again we have the same problems. You have to have the work ethic to keep that stuff in order.
Going,
just like what you're doing right now. You're self-contained. You come in and you're working on something that in the long run will pan out and will be extremely valuable.
Oh, thank you.
But right now, for me, composition is it.
Yeah, you're working on quite a few compositions. You've really gotten into that, and you've won some. You won like a Guggenheim Fellowship, the first major for a jazz artist.
Oh man, it was amazing to me, and my first commission to do music inspired by Elizabeth Catlett's sculptures. That was the Raymond and Beverly Sackler commission. And I can honestly say right now, because I'm 75 years old now, and I still love to play the bass, and I still feel that's what I do best. However, the composition or the process of composition or composing has really got me. And that and the bass are starting to fight each other. for time.
Yeah, it's just there's so much to do, and
yeah,
so
and then life
yeah.
still has to go on. You know, like you have a son, you know,
Yep.
and he's young, and I have my son, and we have these granddaughters now, and I mean, etc. I mean, it just. But if you can, for me, for some reason, and I really think it's because I've been very successful with the people I've played with and recorded, that people will entertain my music. So in some ways it's resonating, and I'm very happy about that, mainly because, you know, everybody's composing something. So, and a lot of people, in fact the majority of people, don't get their music even read, much less played, much less recorded. So I feel very, very blessed that I'm in this position, but because both of them require a great deal of time when you get into the zone.
Yep.
And so I might be writing in a project and something, and I don't even touch the bass for almost 2 weeks, and you know the bass don't like that, and you pay for it when you go back to the, you know, and vice versa. And then I'm hearing, oh man, I gotta sit down and
work on something.
So it's starting to, you know, it's just starting to mess with me now. But I'm in a very special position. I'm trying to keep my health, and hey,
well, keep going on, man. Hopefully we'll get another, 30 years out of you. You got young. What is it, Roy Haynes? What is 95 or something?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's true.
So, thanks for doing this interview. We'll just have you play something, and we'll end here. So people can check you out at rufusreid.com.
That's correct.
All right, thank you, Rufus.
Thank you very much, Jonah.